Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about caribou conservation and One Health, so a little bit of a departure from my normal research. But I want to acknowledge, where we are in the treaty lands and the territories of the Mississauga of the Credit. So I appreciate, Pete, that you kind of already went over this. But I'd also just like to add that from my perspective, I'm a settler with an interest in ecology, and I study caribou primarily. So much of my work is about caribou, and today I'll be summarizing my own personal perception on Caribou One Health in Canada. And so the reason I'm talking about this is because most of the work I'll be presenting has actually been conducted by other people. And a lot of this is stuff I've learned through the peer-reviewed literature or government documents. So in cases where I present work related to conversations that other researchers have had with Indigenous people, I just want to note that I'm grateful for their willingness to talk about their knowledge and experiences and share it in such a way that it can be published and is accessible to read and discuss in seminars like this one. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that before I move on. So we're all here today to sort of talk about and think about One Health. This is a Venn diagram that I've adapted from sort of the classic One Health schematic, where we have environmental, human, and animal health that intersect together as One Health. So One Health is defined by the CDC as a collaborative, multi-sectoral, and transdisciplinary approach where we can work across scales from local, regional, national to global, with the goal of achieving sort of optimal health outcomes for people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. And so the overarching kind of goal of my talk is to sort of talk about how caribou fit into this One Health sort of schematic and sort of present some existing work and knowledge about caribou in Canada. But before I start, I kind of want to just talk about how One Health often takes a zoonotic disease approach. And so if you go to the CDC's website, very quickly with one or two clicks, you are redirected to zoonotic diseases. And so zoonotic diseases are diseases that are spread between animals and people, and so that's the arrows pointing at each other. And this is obviously extremely important. We're sort of in the midst of, or the tail end of, a pandemic, which is a result of a zoonotic disease. So this clearly has major implications for human health as well as animal and environmental health. But interestingly, the Caribou One Health story isn't really related to zoonotic diseases. I'm going to talk a little bit about parasites at the end, but otherwise this is not really a zoonotic disease talk. Instead, I'm going to sort of approach it from an ecological perspective and sort of from the perspective of an ecologist. And so when we think about a healthy environment or the environment in general, or perhaps an unhealthy environment, you might think of something like this image. So that's a tailings pond in Alberta. This is sort of a focus point of, perhaps the oil sands in general. And that's maybe what we think about when we think about things like the oil sands. But of course, there are other sort of components of healthy environments that we can talk about. So this is a photo of a deforested landscape. And then maybe most relevant to caribou, this is a photo of seismic lines in Alberta. So essentially what happens is oil and gas companies will run these seismic lines on the landscape, and they essentially turned it up into a crosswork of these lines where they're looking for possible new reserves. And so from an environmental health perspective, these are all kind of examples of what an unhealthy environment might look like. And from the perspective of a caribou, these are species that are large animals. They require wide, typically undisturbed tracts of land, and when you see things like this, it sort of begs the question: how can they survive in a landscape like this? So here's sort of a few more photos that I think are relevant. The map on the right is from a recently published paper. Each of those gray lines or gray clumps is a linear feature, so either a road, a seismic line, or like a hydroelectric line. And so you can see the high density of gray. The reason it's so dense is because the density of linear features is so high that it just looks like one big sort of clump on the landscape. And so this is northern Alberta. Fort McMurray's at the top of that polygon. We're sort of familiar with that area in general, and this is prime caribou habitat. So if you're a caribou, how do you live in such a fragmented landscape? And on the left is just another photo of sort of what seismic lines might look like as they crisscross the landscape. And so from a caribou perspective, there's I'm a caribou and I'm going to walk on a road or on a seismic line, and you run the risk of getting hit by a car. So this is a photo I took in Newfoundland, not in Alberta, but it's still the same thing. Caribou use linear features, or they can use them, and there's sort of the immediate threat of getting hit by a car or that kind of thing, or coming in contact with people on those landscapes. But more importantly, I think sort of the thing that's most important with regards to how caribou interact with these fragmented landscapes is their primary predators, which are wolves. So wolves effectively, and I'm going to get more into this, use seismic lines, roads, or other linear features as highways. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that, but these are sort of the two scary things if you're a caribou and you live in such a fragmented landscape. And so when people have sort of examined at a sort of Canada-wide scale the effect of anthropogenic disturbance on caribou populations, there's a pretty strong negative effect. So this is from a recent paper in 2020. Each of those dots represents a different caribou population or a year in a population, I think. So there's 40 or 50 population years there, and they look at how anthropogenic disturbance affects recruitment, which is essentially the number of babies per 100 females. So as you might expect, in less disturbed areas, there are more babies, and in more disturbed areas, there are fewer calves. So we know from the literature that caribou populations are in decline due to anthropogenic disturbance. So with that as sort of setup, I'm going to talk about why caribou are at risk and why are they declining. I'm going to sort of talk about Caribou One Health from an Indigenous perspective, and then I'm going to sort of end with some future work that my lab will be doing in the coming years. So why are caribou at risk? What's causing the declines? I kind of alluded to this already, but before we get into that, some Ecology 101. If you've ever taken John's wildlife conservation course or read his book, he has a chapter in his book that's called Counting Animals. How many animals are there? This is one of the most important things we do in ecology. We want to know how many animals they are and where they are. So I'm going to talk about two measures of how many animals there are. Abundance, which is just the total number of animals, and density, which is the number of animals per unit area. So usually that's measured in kilometers squared. And there are entire textbooks and courses dedicated to this question. And it's really important for caribou. So when we think about population density and density dependence, this is a sort of key aspect of population dynamics and studying populations. So at high density, survival and reproduction are typically low. And so you can sort of imagine this as there being lots and lots of animals on the landscape. The landscape is sort of at carrying capacity with regards to how many animals it can actually carry. And so reproduction is low because the landscape can't actually support any more animals. Whereas at low density, survival and reproduction typically are a bit higher because there's more sort of room on the landscape to expand. But density can also affect other aspects of animals' life, so life history, morphology, behavior. And these are all things that I'm kind of interested in as well. And so when we sort of think about this in a visual way, we can think about birth or survival rate on the y-axis with density on the x-axis, and then K being the carrying capacity. So the red line is essentially showing how, as density increases, the carrying capacity or the number of animals that could be sustained on the landscape is decreasing. So this is sort of like, again, classic ecology, and we can sort of apply it to our caribou conservation problem. And just a few other examples of density dependence sort of from an animal health perspective. And these are caribou examples, but I mean, similar examples exist for lots of other taxa. So this study from the 80s showed that as caribou density increased, jawbone length, which is just a measure that people will use for sort of size and health, decreases. And then similarly, as abundance increased, the body mass of newborn calves was decreasing. I think it's newborn calves at the end of the summer was decreasing as well. So we can see that from a health perspective, animals are smaller when population density is higher. And this is kind of important from kind of getting into that One Health perspective and bringing these sort of classic ecological ideas into One Health. So as we sort of move from density dependence into how many animals are there, caribou declines are ubiquitous. So these are examples from 4 herds across Canada. The top left is George River in Labrador. Below that is a herd in the Yukon, and then the 2 on the right are herds from Newfoundland. We see very similar patterns of increased, followed by a rapid decline in the sort of late 90s into the early 2000s. And this decline is more or less ubiquitous among all caribou herds. It's happening everywhere. And so we might want to know why. One explanation, and one thing that I think is sort of interesting to think about, is that caribou populations tend to be cyclic. So often, we might learn about population cycles for snowshoe hare or lemmings or animals that have very short lifespans. But caribou are very similar, and they have really long cycles. So from the peak of one cycle to the peak of the next cycle could be 100 years. And so, as Western scientists, we have not been collecting data on caribou population abundance for that long. So this is actually a figure from a document called UPCART, which is the Ungava Peninsula Caribou Aboriginal Roundtable, which was published in 2017 by a group of indigenous communities in Labrador. And so the black and red lines represent sort of surveys done by the government or other organizations from about the mid-50s to present-ish. And then the dashed line represents sort of traditional ecological knowledge and traditional indigenous knowledge of population fluctuations going back hundreds of years. And so, based on that evidence, it suggests that caribou populations are cyclic. And so the declines we're seeing now could just be the sort of trough of those cycles. And so you might make the case that, if we just wait 40 years, they'll be back up to that peak again. And that may be the case, but there are so many other factors that are at play here. So yeah, why are caribou facing these declines? So some people would argue that caribou populations are cyclic and the current declines are natural. I think there's a case to be made for habitat alteration and destruction. So what happens here is, as I mentioned or sort of alluded to, as soon as you start altering or destroying habitat, especially with regards to linear features, this changes the predator-prey dynamics in the system. So this is through human-induced means, but it can also happen through natural habitat destruction as well. So I'm not going to talk about fire today, but it's kind of worth noting that that's also sort of something that's at play with regards to caribou. And then climate change is also a major issue for caribou. So climate change is affecting food availability for these animals, as well as sort of increased insect harassment as climate warms and the insect growing season increases as well. And then of course there's extreme weather, which is sort of affecting all animals in various ways. So kind of going forward, I'm going to talk about the ones highlighted in red. So I'll start off by talking about predator-prey dynamics sort of in a human-altered landscape, and then I'll talk a bit more about food availability and insects later. So if you're a caribou and you are living your life, this is where you want to live. It's sort of dense, unfragmented landscape where there's likely plenty of food and cover for you to exist in this landscape. And most importantly, this is a landscape where predators will not find you. However, we've seen this map already. Once we sort of chop up the landscape into all these tiny pieces, we get roads and we get seismic lines where wolves can sort of show up on the scene. And so the reason why this is important is, it's kind of, maybe it's intuitive, but caribou are sort of crappy prey. They're not very good at avoiding predators. Their major predator avoidance strategy is to essentially just live where nothing else can live. That's why caribou are more or less the only Arctic ungulates, and they can live on these sort of extremely desolate islands in the far north. They can live in that deep forest, and they can live off low quality food, so lichen. No other ungulates can do that, and so that's their primary predator avoidance strategy. And then they can also live in areas with deep snow. They can walk through very deep snow, whereas moose and white-tailed deer and elk, they just they can't do that. They have other strategies to avoid predators. So as soon as we start chopping up the landscape, this means that predators can access those areas. And so what that's called, sort of in a classic ecological sense, is disturbance-mediated apparent competition, or some people just call it apparent competition. So the idea here, this infographic from a paper in PNAS published a few years ago, I'm kind of going to walk through from the bottom to the top. So what happens is habitat is destroyed. We have our fragmented landscapes. That means there's greater access to this caribou range, or previously occupied caribou habitat for moose and white-tailed deer. Wolves typically live mostly off of moose and white-tailed deer. So they follow their prey into caribou habitat. And now we have a multi-prey system where there's deer, moose, and caribou. As I said, caribou are not very good at avoiding predators when they're there. So wolves then switch prey and essentially go after caribou because they're easier to catch than a moose, which is huge, or a deer, which is fast. And caribou populations decline. So the disturbance-mediated part of this means that disturbance on the landscape is causing prey, which are competitors to caribou, to enter the system. And then the apparent part of this concept is sort of the indirect effect of other prey on caribou. So the effect of white-tailed deer and moose on caribou exists through wolves. And so it's kind of a complicated ecological concept that really sort of bears fruit in this system, and it holds up in other systems as well. But essentially, this is a huge problem, and so there's a few different ways to tackle this issue, and you can think of them as habitat restoration, control of the other prey, so to increase hunting on deer and moose, or to do predator control, and all three of those are management strategies that have been employed in places like BC and Alberta to varying degrees of success. And I'm not really going to get too much into it, but I can sort of talk about it a bit after. But essentially, not any one of those strategies on their own is unsuccessful. You have to do multiple strategies to conserve caribou populations. And I think the sort of take home here is that fragmentation, conservation, and One Health with caribou are sort of all interlinked. When we alter the environment that caribou are living in, it affects their sort of conservation and how we can approach this from a One Health perspective and think about caribou health kind of as a more holistic idea. So talking about Caribou One Health, I think from my perspective anyway, Caribou One Health is inherently tied to the relationship between Indigenous people and caribou. So there's a paper published in 2020 by Consulo and colleagues out of Labrador, and the title of the paper includes a quote from one of their interview participants where this person said, "You can never replace the caribou." So caribou populations are in decline, and folks who rely on those populations kind of summarized here that you can never replace them. So this is the citation for that article, and so essentially this article goes into some detail about how caribou declines have an effect on Indigenous food security, cultural identity, and livelihoods. And they talk to participants and people who live off the land in Labrador about how the relationship between these people and caribou has sort of been affected through time. And we know a little bit about this, but I think this is one of the first sort of studies where the authors sort of dig into how caribou declines affect the emotional, affective, and ontological sort of perspectives on people. And so it's a really interesting read, and I decided not to provide any further quotes. There's lots of information in there, but I think the "you can never replace caribou" quote is sort of the biggest takeaway. And essentially, from a human health perspective, caribou declines are very much affecting Indigenous people. And so I'm going to kind of pivot from that point and talk about how in many places in Canada there is sort of a push for Indigenous-led conservation. So to stay in Labrador, I mentioned this, UPCART is the name of the group, the Ungava Peninsula Caribou Aboriginal Roundtable. So this is a group of Indigenous communities that sort of came together in the early 2010s, and they sort of formed this group that wrote this document called A Long Time Ago in the Future. And their mission is to work together in solidarity among all of the communities to preserve caribou and the relationships that they have with them while respecting sort of the different cultures that are coming together. And so this document is really interesting because it's a self-organized group of people in Labrador, or Indigenous people in Labrador, and they incorporate sort of current and past knowledge, both from an Indigenous perspective and a Western science perspective. And so this document outlines a number of priorities with regards to caribou in that region. And so there's dozens of priorities, but I'll just sort of highlight a few of them that I think are relevant and important. So one of the main priorities is research and monitoring. So they plan to monitor caribou through co-management, which includes incorporating Indigenous knowledge and Western science. And they also plan to monitor caribou health and body condition. So that was another big part of this document, is they're talking a lot about caribou health and how people have noticed over time that caribou have become more sickly or they've become smaller or calves are dying younger and things like that. And so all of these ideas related to animal health that we can think of from a One Health perspective are really sort of inherent to the experience of these people. And then another big one, of course, is to assess the impacts of human development and to monitor that development as well. And so these are all sort of key parts of the Indigenous-led conservation effort that's happening in Labrador right now. Another example is from British Columbia. So this is a sort of more recent example. So Lamb and colleagues published this paper in 2022 along with sort of accompanying study. But in this example, what they did was they highlighted how Indigenous-led recovery of this caribou population, Klinza, which is sort of in central BC, started, I think it's about 2014 or 2013, when the population was sort of at a low. And since that time, the population has more than doubled in size. And so what they did was they used what are called maternity pens. You may have heard of these in the news. But essentially, they move all of the pregnant females into a large enclosure, a big pen, during the sort of calving season, and they provide supplementary feeding during that time. And that really helps, I think, reduce the calf loss for these herds. The community also engaged in predator reduction as well as habitat restoration, which, again, as I mentioned earlier, any of these strategies on their own is not necessarily going to make an impact, but when the sort of additive effects of these strategies come together, we start to see increases in populations. And so the study sort of talks about why it worked. This is an Indigenous-led effort, and the Indigenous people involved sort of exercised their rights. It had success fairly quickly and increased survival and recruitment of the animals. And then it was also a collaborative effort between the community and government and academics. So it was sort of an interesting example of how this could work in one case in British Columbia. And I should note this idea of maternal penning is fairly common in British Columbia, and it's definitely happening elsewhere as well. Another example is of Indigenous-led conservation is in the Northwest Territories, where a group of us talked about this paper recently. But it's essentially an adjustment to the species at risk listing process in Northwest Territories. And so this process establishes sort of, they're calling it a side-by-side species assessment, where one assessment is based on Indigenous knowledge and the other is based on scientific knowledge. And that feeds into a single status report, which the assessment committee can sort of draw on. And so each assessment sort of has relevant information that can come together. And I think it's worth noting that while this works in some cases, it doesn't always work because there could be discrepancy in how an Indigenous knowledge system might list a species or suggest listing, whereas a scientific knowledge system might suggest something different. And as we read this paper, I think it was actually a Caribou example where the two knowledge systems had different listings, but in the end, the committee chose to go with the more conservative listing, which I think was threatened for the caribou that were in this area, which was the recommendation by the Indigenous knowledge system. Whereas the scientific knowledge system suggested least concern, I think. So they did go with a more conservative listing based on Indigenous knowledge. So it's another example of how Indigenous-led caribou conservation can sort of work and is being implemented. So I think Caribou One Health inherently includes Indigenous knowledge systems and the participation of Indigenous people. And these examples, among many others, suggest that caribou conservation is often the most effective when Indigenous and Western scientific knowledge are integrated together, sort of with co-participation. So I'm kind of going to end off by just talking a little bit about some of the ongoing work in my lab. So most of my work happens on Fogo Island in Newfoundland. So the inset is Newfoundland, and Fogo is a small island off the northeast coast of Newfoundland. So there are about 2,000 people that live in 10 or so communities on this island, but it's very rural, and there is a small caribou population there. And I think the interesting thing about this population is, well, there are a few things, but there are no predators. There are coyotes, but they're not really a sort of threat to caribou. It's a relatively intact landscape, so the only roads are kind of outlined in black there. And the roads don't really have a major effect on them. There's no hydro lines crossing the island either. And we can monitor individual animals sort of throughout their life. Whereas if you imagine a caribou in northern Ontario or northern Quebec, they are, there's no way to get to them, there's no way to find them once you perhaps collar them once. Whereas we are able to capture and collar animals and then follow them essentially for as long as they're alive. And so this is sort of my favorite photo that I've ever taken on Fogo Island. So we were camping, we were on this island here, we were camping. This is the caribou who showed up in the morning to have breakfast with us, and there's an iceberg floating by. So it's like sort of, two of the major tourist opportunities when you go to Newfoundland happened all at once while our crew had breakfast. So it really is a magical place, and I think it's a really interesting place to study caribou. And so one of our major questions is, what are caribou eating? So we recently published a review on this topic because there's somewhat of a dogma in the caribou world that caribou are essentially lichen specialists, and this is something that I think is, sort of what a lot of people talk about. But I have watched plenty of caribou eat lichen and plenty of caribou eat other things too. So in our review, we did find that in the winter, caribou are lichen specialists, and that makes sense because everything else is dead or under snow. And lichen, because it's not a vascular plant, it sort of is the same year-round. So it makes sense that caribou would specialize on lichen in the winter. However, in the summer, they become generalists, and they'll pretty much eat anything. So we've watched them eat, the fresh leaves off of shrubs and grass. They'll basically eat anything in the summer when it's available. However, habitat destruction can affect food availability, and sort of we found a bit of this in our review as well, and especially lichen, which takes a long time to regenerate. So even though caribou will eat anything in the winter, if all the lichen is gone or destroyed, that affects their ability to survive through the winter. So from an animal health perspective, obviously, what you eat is really important for nutrition, and that's kind of an important part of health. And so we've sort of been doing some data collection on things like tooth wear from dead animals and things like that, which kind of give us a hint at sort of the health of these animals as, through time, I guess. So back to that sort of fundamental ecological concept of density dependence. Our system is really small, so there's only about 250 or so animals that live on this island. And from 2016 till about 2020, it was very stable, like 250, 280 animals, very little fluctuation. And then the pandemic hit, and we didn't go there for 2 years, and we went back. Well, I wasn't there, but my colleagues went back last year, and there was no animals left. And so it's kind of like, where did they go? Did they leave? We know they swim, they could have left. And so we were sort of puzzled about what happened, and we suspect that it was sort of just it's part of this natural decline that we're seeing in other herds, and because this herd is so small, it's sort of just happening later or some other factor. So we now know that there are fewer animals. So we have sort of this unique opportunity to compare caribou health across two population density measures. So we suspect now there's about 100 animals left. We have lots of data from prior to the pandemic, and we're collecting more data now to sort of get an idea of how things like body size, nutrition, diet, parasite load, and behavior might change between these two periods of time. So this is something that's ongoing, and folks in my lab are going to be sort of answering some of these questions over the coming years. But just to sort of note that this isn't for Fogo, but for another herd, population density does have an effect on behavior. So one of my PhD chapters, we looked at how density affects group size. Typically, we would expect a positive effect or no effect at all. But we actually found negative effects of density on group size, which I sort of chalk up to competition for high quality food. Animals in big groups would have lots of competition. So if population density is very high, we expect more competition. And if we had really big groups, that could sort of put animals over the edge. So what I think is happening is they tend to form smaller groups and kind of space out on the landscape to avoid that competition. So another example of how density dependence can affect different aspects of caribou life. So an incoming student in my lab, Shayla, will be kind of tackling the caribou foraging part of the story. So as I said, Fogo is a relatively intact landscape. We'll have the possibility of comparing diet across, first of all, across that density gradient from prior to the pandemic to after. But we also have the opportunity to compare diet across herds living in different landscapes. So we have like literally a freezer full of poop from caribou on Fogo, which we could compare to measures of diet in other herds where the landscape is more fragmented. I'm also interested in testing or asking some questions about how diet changes through time and how diet changes with the availability of food and how that affects things like body size, microbiome, and parasitism. So I think these are all questions that will probably fall under Shayla's work, and she's starting in September. So this is kind of just a to be determined, a series of to be determined questions. I kind of mentioned at the top that climate change can affect caribou, and one of the ways that this happens is through flying insects. So an undergrad in my lab, Brennan, has been working on this, and so we expect that climate change will result in a northern range increase for flying insects like black flies, warble flies, bot flies. And these can be pretty nasty for caribou because they do reduce body condition and perhaps reproductive success. So what Brennan did is he looked at patterns of habitat selection for females with and without calves. So I'm just showing some of the results. On the y-axis, we have some habitat types and then the distance to the coastline. So this is an interesting system because caribou, essentially, from anecdotal evidence, they stand on a cliff next to the ocean because it's really windy. And so my theory was they do this because it's so buggy that the only place to get relief from the insects is to stand on a cliff next to the ocean or to be in other windy areas. So we sort of tested how wind speed and the proximity to the ocean affect, which we sort of use as proxies for insect harassment, essentially are affected by whether or not caribou have calves or not. So when it comes to wind speed, we actually find that females with calves tend to be in these areas of very high wind speed, which makes sense. If you have a calf, you want to conserve as much energy as you can to help make sure that calf survives through the summer. Whereas females with no calves tend to avoid areas with high wind, and they're probably just off foraging. They can sort of recoup any energetic loss that they might suffer from the insects. Whereas it's sort of, with regards to being close to the coastline, females with no calves, it's kind of the same story. It's sort of the opposite here. Anyways, it doesn't really matter why, but it's sort of the opposite pattern. Females with no calves tend to avoid the coast. Again, they're probably just foraging. They can get away with not necessarily avoiding those insects, whereas females with a calf are essentially, they're selecting to be in high wind areas and they're selecting to be close to the coast as well. And then when we sort of look at this from a habitat perspective, animals that are further from the coast in the purple dot here with no calf, they're in the forest. So they basically bed down under the trees and they're hiding out from the insects that way. So it's sort of an alternative strategy. So I think this is a really interesting example of how the possibility of insect harassment is changing behavior and how it affects behavior differentially for females if they have calves versus if they don't. And then sort of the last thing is this idea of caribou parasite dynamics. So in general, caribou are they don't really have a ton of parasites, and the parasites they do have tend not to be too bad, unlike other animals. And so an incoming PhD student in the lab, Allegra, is going to tackle this question. And so there's this idea that sort of depending on the type of parasite, the type of transmission required is going to vary. So this is sort of a 3D graph of different types of transmission. So the bottom is spatial transmission, and the center is social transmission, and then there's different sort of strategies for the animals. So caribou might be in a group, or if they're alone, the effect of different types of parasites might vary. So for example, viruses require social transmission. So in the hypothetical layer of social transmission, we would expect that when they're more social, a virus would transmit more rapidly through the group. Whereas for endoparasites, these are often transmitted through feces. There's not really a social component, so there's no kind of lump in that social layer, whereas the spatial component is very strong. And similarly for ectoparasites, there's not really a social component to transmission, but rather it's spatial. And so for caribou, the sort of parasite of interest has an inherent spatial component. So it's a nematode called a Laphostrongylus rangiferi. And the life cycle is basically such that a caribou will ingest an infected gastropod. It's usually a slug. And the larvae of that parasite is in the gastropod. It develops into a worm inside the caribou. And it sort of sheds new larvae in the gut, which are pooped out. And gastropods eat the poop, and it sort of the cycle continues. But the problem is the worms migrate from the gut to the central nervous system, and they disrupt the function of the central nervous system. And so caribou can host this nematode at relatively low levels, and it's not really a problem. But it's for young animals or for older animals, it can cause major problems and disrupt motor function. So essentially what happens is caribou, I think the term is ataxia. They lose control of their hind limbs, and they basically walk in circles, and they can't not walk in circles. So they either die of starvation or a predator comes and gets them. So this parasite is actually co-evolved with reindeer in Europe. And so it's all over Scandinavia, and for whatever reason with reindeer, they are sort of immune to it, or there's no adverse effects. But in North America, it's not native here, and it did not co-evolve with caribou. So that's fine. But in Newfoundland and Alaska, people in the early 1900s, classic sort of colonial settler move, tried to bring animals from somewhere else over. So they brought reindeer from Norway to Newfoundland and to Alaska, essentially to try and get locals to adopt like a herding lifestyle to help with food security in these sort of remote areas. And obviously it didn't work. There are no reindeer in Newfoundland, but they were around for long enough to essentially poop out these parasites, which now live in Newfoundland and have sort of made their way across the whole island. And so for the most part in Newfoundland, caribou aren't dying from this anymore, but Fogo Island was only recently, this parasite was only recently introduced into our system. So they do die from it, and so it's kind of an area of interest that we're going to get into. And although Elaphostrongylis regiferae has not been found in moose, there are other similar nematodes that kind of are carried by moose that can come over to caribou as well. So it sort of adds a multi-host component to this question. And so obviously this is all related to animal health, and I'm hoping Allegra will really be able to dig into this question. And then the last sort of project that I'd like to sort of tackle in the future has more to do with like human health and human perceptions of caribou. So the caribou on Fogo Island were introduced. They were brought there in the 60s and for conservation reasons. They're also a hunted population. And there's lots of anecdotal evidence from locals of how caribou ranges on the island have changed through time. So I'm just curious how locals think about caribou, and what their perception is of the declines, and then what the perception of locals is related to sort of environmental health and caribou health in general. So this is something I'm kind of thinking about getting more into from like a One Health perspective and focusing more on the human side of things. But yeah, this is very much a to be determined project. So yeah, hopefully I've kind of convinced you today that caribou conservation is inherently a One Health issue, and that when we think about One Health, sort of we can think about the ecological side of things and kind of draw back to those classic ideas that we learned in ecology classes, and kind of bring it to this broader One Health perspective. And while zoonotic diseases are very important, I think it's also kind of worthwhile to think about these problems from other perspectives as well. So yeah, I'd like to thank all my co-authors, collaborators, and funders, and yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.